Time to take the Hudson apart. First thing I'm going to do is take the trim off that is easily damaged if you forget to take it off as you're disassembling. For that reason, I'll go first to the lubricator lever. By the way, I'm going to put the parts in a tray so the parts don't get misplaced. Just take your needle nose pliers and pull it out of the boiler, put it in the tray. Next part is the reach rod on the power reverse cylinder. Has a tiny hex head screw holding it on. If you're lucky enough to have a 7/64 nut driver, it is the best tool to use there. Otherwise, very carefully with smooth-jawed pliers. That takes care of what's on the right side. On the left side, first we have to get the feed water pipe out of the way, and there's a set screw with a slotted head that holds that feed water pipe in. You pull the pipe out of the socket and out of the feed water pump. Now we need to take the trailing truck off so we can get access to the ash pan, because if we forget to take the feed water pump off before we take the boiler off, we're going to bend some parts, and like to have all the parts left in as new condition. Trailing trucks down, springs, lock washers, flanged washers, and screws. One round head screw releases the ash pan, and once it's released, all you have to do is pry it past the feed water pump screw, and it will come out. Now we can take a 3/16 nut driver and remove the feed water pump screw, which allows us to remove the feed water pump and feed water pump bracket. There they are. This is more or less the parts that you don't have to take off if you're disassembling a 763. Next thing you want to do is remove the boiler front or the light bulb, either one first. Dark in there. Got to get the screwdriver in the slot of the blackhead screw. The boiler front simply pulls off, and you unscrew the light bulb. Now we're ready to take the boiler off. There are 3 screws. There's a screw in the smokestack holding it front, and there's a screw on each side at the rear holding the frame to the boiler. Once these screws are removed, you can stand the boiler up and lift it straight off the locomotive. If your boiler has been distorted, it has probably tightened up in this area and rubs on this lead weight. If so, carefully work it up to get it off the lead weight. Remove the lead weight. Tipping it will allow you to remove it from under the wiring harness. This allows you to access to the worm housing cover. Removing it. This allows you to lift the front end of the worm shaft so that you can remove it from the flexible coupling. It also frees the flexible coupling. To remove the motor, this half of the flexible coupling has to be removed, so you loosen the set screw and remove that. The last thing you want to loosen is the screws on the motor, because you want to flex the wires as little as possible. So what we'll do is we will take the pickups loose, take the lamp bracket loose, remove the two screws that hold the E unit. And using a tight-fitting 1/4 inch, or if you can get it, a nut driver that actually fits the odd size hex heads on the motor screws. Loosen the motor screws. And this allows you to remove the entire electrical assembly in one piece. Take the screws that we've taken out, put them in the tray so they don't get lost. Next item, the valve gear. First, remove the left side combination lever to eccentric link screw. In case you're curious, that's a 5/32 nut driver. Then, using a carefully prepared 3/16 nut driver that has had its face ground flush so there's no recess, because this crank pin screw has very little surface to unscrew it, and if you use pliers you'll scratch it. If you use a standard nut driver, it will ride off and round the corners. But by using a nut driver that has been prepared for that shallow contact, remove the two eccentric crank screws, work the eccentric cranks out of their recesses, and out of the main rods. The eccentric cranks may be tight on the crank pins and require careful prying out. If so, a way to do it is to take two thin screwdrivers on either side of the main rod and twist and push the eccentric crank out. In this case, I didn't need to do that, but frequently that is necessary. If the eccentric crank breaks while you're removing it, it was defective and should have been replaced anyway, so you have not lost anything. Finish by unscrewing the valve gear hanger screws and place the valve gear hanger to the side. With the crank pin away from the steam chest, you can pull the main rod back and at the same time pull the valve crosshead back. Repeat that on the other side. The crosshead guide supports are held in place by a single screw. And on the left side, it has very little clearance and will be tight removing it, but it will slide out if nothing is warped or damaged. While we're at it, we pick up the ladders that were released when I took the boiler off. We take the roller pickups out. Remove the pilot truck. While this is upside down, in case the frame is going to need straightening, You must remove this Bakelite insulator, otherwise it will be broken when trying to straighten the frame. And remove the 2 screws that hold the steam chest. We have now stripped the chassis down to its basic parts, and any maintenance such as on the wheels or straightening the frame can be done. We don't need to remove the cowcatcher, and I don't recommend it unless it is broken, or because the 1 screw that holds it on there is difficult to remove without marking it. So we're going to leave that on. When Lionel started making the 700E in 1937, they decided to put serial numbers on the frames. You can see a serial number here between the rear and front pilot truck mounting screws. This particular one, being in 1937, is a 6-digit number beginning 01. They use numbers from 010001 up to a little over 01-2000 in 1937, showing that they made slightly more than 2,000 engines that year. In 1938, they changed the prefix from 01 to 38 and used numbers starting probably with 1001, the highest number being slightly more than 382600, which shows that they made about 1,600, less than 1,700 engines in 1938. The scheme to put serial numbers on the frames was abandoned in 1939 and did not appear on any later production. Reassembly is essentially the reverse of disassembly. First thing we'll put back is the insulator for the front collector. In the 1937 and early 38, this is held in with a flathead screw. Later ones used a roundhead screw. Either one works, and the parts are interchangeable. After that, we'll put the steam chest on the front of the locomotive, and it fits in its position snugly and is fastened with the 2 Philster head slotted screws. We'll add the crosshead guide supports. Which use a single 3/48 flathead screw. These are installed If you get the crank pin of the front driver out of the way, you can slide the crosshead guide support into place. It is a tight fit. And putting the finger next to it as you drop the screw in helps get the screw into the hole. Tighten screws snugly, because if they're not snug, they will shake loose, and it's very difficult to take everything out of the way to get the screws to tighten them again. Next, we can insert the valve crosshead and main rod on each side, noting that the right side main rod is installed with the oil cup on top of the big end of the main rod. This is slid into the crosshead guide and engaged with the nub on the valve crosshead, and both parts moved as far forward as possible. And next we'll install the other valve crosshead. After it's in the valve crosshead guide, we'll put the main rod with the combination lever assembly attached into the guide, engage the hole in the combination lever on the nub of the valve crosshead, and insert the valve crosshead and main rod all the way forward. Now we're ready to install the valve gear hanger and valve gear. It has two flathead screws, except in 1938, for some reason, they used panhead screws, but it's the same function. And this assembly fits into recesses in the frame, so it is located, and we run the screws down snug but not tight. We will tighten them later, because we may need to do some critical alignment of the valve gear hanger as we proceed. At this time, we can connect the combination lever to the eccentric link on the left side. We don't connect it on the right side because later we will be installing the lubricator lever and it has to be put in before the screw is installed. It's now time to put the eccentric crank into the main rod, into the side rod, onto the crank pin of the center driver, and this is worked in. And on the left side, you want the crank to be to the left of the axle, and on the right side, it's the reverse. The crank is to the right of the axle. The screw has a 3/16 hex and has a very shallow engagement. I have taken my 3/16 nut driver and ground flat to remove the relief that guides the bolt head in order to get engagement on the very thin extension of the head. On the other side, we have to make the same connection. You notice that we do not connect the combination lever to the eccentric link, because that will be done at final assembly. We're going to once again put the crank into the main rod, put the crank into the side rod. Now we're on the right side of the engine, so we want to be to the right of the axle with the eccentric crank, and we push it in until it seats. Add the hex screw that retains the eccentric crank. Tighten it. And move on. Next thing we'll put on is the electrical assembly, the motor, the wiring harness, the reversing unit, and the lamp bracket. To keep from damaging the wiring, it's best to put the motor in first and secure it so we don't unnecessarily flex the old brittle wires. As noted in removal, these screws have an odd hex head size, which I've been able to tighten with a 1/4-inch nut driver that has minimum clearances, but may require tightening with a small wrench. They must be tight, otherwise in use they'll come loose. Turning the chassis around, we can place the reversing unit on its mounting point and secure it with these two very short 4/36 flathead screws. Let gravity help you by putting the first screw in until the thread is caught. Put the second screw in while it will still rest in its recess, and this keeps you from dropping the screws and having to turn the chassis over to shake them out. Just makes life easier. Next, the light bracket is mounted with this little round head 1/4 inch 632 screw. Yes, it is inconvenient, but this has proven to be the best way to install this while minimizing stress on the wires. Tighten this securely. Now we have 2 terminals with screws, which we left in the terminals. Those are going to go through and are going to secure the roller collectors. Which are here. Properly, the stud that the collector is mounted on is not tight to the collector because you're going to install this, and after you have installed it and tightened the terminal screw, you tighten the collector mounting screw. In this manner, the critical screw, the inside screw, is tight. If you ever remove the roller collector, you don't worry about the screw getting loose inside. And last thing you do is tighten the roller collector screw. We similarly install the front roller collector, making sure that the square part of the stud goes into the insulator. And since I dropped the screw, I'll have to put it back into the terminal lug. And the electricals are now installed. I tighten the roller collector, and we're ready to proceed with the assembly of the gears and flexible coupling. The motor flexible coupling had to be removed to take the motor out of the frame. We will now put it back in and seat it fully on the armature shaft and tighten the set screw. Assuring that we have adequate grease, fresh grease, on the gear, and that our worm shaft is clean and greased, and that our bearings have plenty of oil on them. We're ready now to put the rubber coupling on the motor and put the worm shaft into the rubber coupling, dropping it in with the tapers on the bearing blocks, thin side down, so that the worm shaft will seat fully in the recess, like so. We can now put the gasket and worm cover using the 2 screws that do not hold the lead weight to put it tight on the worm housing. Now we're going to check and see that it turns properly. Ready to run. It's now a good time to make an electrical check to make sure that we don't need to service the reversing unit or do something else to the electrical system, because after we have covered it, it's difficult to work on. Obviously the grease is dry and needs to be run. It's now running more normally. The test set provides just 12 volts, which is the minimum operating voltage for this locomotive. It is now ready to continue assembly. The lead weight goes on next. With the screw removed, it's easy to slip it under the wiring harness into its place. And since it is a lead weight, avoid over tightening the screws because they will just dig into the soft lead. We're now ready to put the boiler on it. Since this is not a 37 model, we lower the boiler straight down on the frame and look to line up the booster steam pipe in the hole in the steam chest. The screw is already sitting in the smokestack, so I engage it about 1.5 turns. I'll turn the engine over using the 2 3/4 inch 632 flathead screws. Loosely connect the rear of the frame to the boiler. Because I still have to get the handrails and the front ladders engaged on the pilot beam. The rectangular part of the ladder goes in the socket in the pilot beam. But first, we put the handrails in the small holes beside the flag holders. Now I can put the rectangular end of the ladder in its socket. And let it find the hole in the running board. Now I take the other one. Now you notice I did the right one first. For some reason, the right one has more engagement than the left one. If you do the left one first, it will probably fall out as you put the right one in. We have now secured that. We can now tighten the screw. Now we tighten the 3 boiler mounting screws, and we're ready to start putting the trim on. The first trim I would put on is the feed water pump. The feed water bracket pump and screw go into the 2 small holes that if you don't have good light, you can't see them. Put the screw through the bracket. Then put the feed water pump on the screw. Use a 3/16 nut driver to secure that. Now you can put the ash pan on. Which is worked down into the ejector supply and return pipe under the locating pins and forced into position because it's a tight fit. I use a screwdriver to pry this into the locating pins, and that seems to work to get it in place. Some people have retracted the locating pins. My personal opinion is do anything you want because it doesn't make any difference. We have a little 436 screw that's the only screw that secures the ash pan. And the last piece is the feed water pipe, which goes in the hole in the feed water pump screw and then into the recess in the cab, and the last thing we do is tighten the slotted set screw that holds that in place. If you wish, you could put the trailing truck on now because it's conveniently exposed. You could also put the pilot truck on, but let's go ahead and finish the assembly. The power reverse reach rod is inserted in the power reverse cylinder and bolted to the valve gear hanger. Using this very small 080 screw, and the final trim piece to put in is the lubricator lever. It will be assembled through this combination lever hole and into this hole in the boiler casting. And after it's in there, this screw with a hole in it will secure the lubricator lever. I'm going to take the lubricator lever and fish it up through the bolt hole for the combination eccentric link. Now I'm going to take a screwdriver and put it behind the lubricator link so that I can put the screw onto the lubricator link. Having done that, we'll work it down and try to engage it in the eccentric link. And once it's engaged in the eccentric link, we can tighten the screw, and it is secure, but it needs to be seated in the boiler. Now it is secure, it is seated in the boiler, and we are ready to put the light bulb and the boiler front on the locomotive. Light bulb's removed because the boiler would hit it trying to remove it. The boiler front, as a habit, I leave the screws in it because they're very close to the size of the screws that secure the electrical terminal lugs to the roller collectors. And this way I don't confuse the two and put the short screws on the boiler front and the long screws on the pickups. Tightening nicely, snapping the catch shut. The only thing left is the pilot and trailing trucks. The front screw of the pilot truck has a conical washer, a finishing washer, and a lock washer. The screw goes through the truck. The finishing washer bears on the truck. The conical spring seats in the finishing washer, and the last item is the lock washer, which keeps it from shaking loose as the train is running. And we secure that one first. Then we have the rear pilot truck screw, the screw, number T110 washer, a very special soft spring, which by the way is the same spring as in a 418 standard gauge passenger car pickup spring, a flanged washer with the neck on the screw, and a lock washer, all as an assembly inserted through the large hole in the pilot truck into the tapped hole in the frame, and that finishes securing the pilot truck. The trailing truck has two identical screws. We'll do the front one first. We put the screw up through the trailing truck. We put the flanged washer to bear on the trailing truck. We put the spring on the flanged washer and the locking washer so that it won't shake loose as the train runs. That holds the front of the trailing truck. The rear of the trailing truck uses the identical components assembled in the same manner, in this case through the slot in the trailing truck, the flange washer, the spring, and the lock washer. At this point, the engine is completely assembled and ready to run.
Set it up on.
Seems to cycle properly. Job's finished. In 1935, Lionel set off on its most ambitious project to date, the creation of a true-to-scale replica of the famous New York Central J3 Hudson locomotive. Ambitious in design, unlike any other model train produced before, a scale model built to sell for a fraction of the cost of contemporary models. If you collect Lionel trains, this is the holy grail, the train many collectors have spent years, even decades, searching for. Let's get started.